and welcome to the Sangamon Experience Community Trailblazers program that we offer every Wednesday at noon here on our social media accounts for the Sangamon Experience at UIS. My name is Ann Mosley. I'm the director and curator for the Sangamon Experience, and I'm here to talk to you today about the pioneer women of Sangamon County. Now, there are so many early settlers of women and children and family members that have come across the eastern portion of the United States into the Midwest when Illinois was forming as a state, and even before that, when it served as a territory. And a lot of the pioneer women that came through here had to travel on wagon, horseback, walked all their way here to the prairie land. Now, there are some names that I'll be able to mention to you of the female pioneers that came through Sangamon County, but most of the women just go unmentioned. They traveled with their husbands. They traveled out here to start a new life and to make a better life for themselves and for their family members, or even just to find a husband. That tended to drive a lot of women out here to the Midwest. Now, the first people who lived here in Illinois, of course, were the Native Americans. They were the original individuals who lived here, and I would be amiss for not mentioning them first. A lot of these women lived with the Illini tribes that were scattered throughout here in central Illinois. We also have the Kickapoo Indians, as well as the Peoria tribes that settled here, and eventually the Mississippian. And my background's not in Native American history, but I encourage you to come back and listen to another one of our programs where we do discuss about the individuals who lived here first in Illinois. We will be having a series of programs that will focus on the indigenous peoples who lived here in Illinois. I also encourage you to reach out to one of our partners, the Illinois State Museum, who does a wonderful job on talking about the indigenous peoples who lived here throughout the state of Illinois, not just here in Central. Now, the settlers who came into Central Illinois, you can find a lot of their documentation through oral history records that are kept by John Powers. Well, John Power, who wrote the early settler history of Sangamon County. And that can be found here at the Lincoln Public Library here in Springfield. You can also find them at our state library here in Illinois, as well as the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, which has a rich collection of letters, diaries, and different accounts of the early settlers here in Sangamon County. Most of the records that I was able to find for this program came from, of course, Sangamon Link, which is a frequent source for a lot of the research that I do, but also within our own University of Illinois archives. Most of you who are familiar with local history are familiar with the Illinois Regional Depositories, Illinois Regional Archives Depositories, stationed throughout the state of Illinois. The University of Illinois Springfield is home to the Central Illinois region of the Illinois State Archives. And when you come into the archives today, it'll look kind of very similar when it was Sangamon State. So it's easier to find a lot of the deed records and some of the personal accounts from the earlier state records and early county records. Now, for a lot of the numbers, you can easily look at deed records to see early settlements. But I would recommend diving into a lot of the diaries and letters that were written during the time. A lot of women were eager writers during the early settlement of Illinois. You had family members writing out to the east, describing what the prairie land was like. You also have family members trying to encourage them and entice them to move here to Central Illinois to become farmers, buy up land, and at the time, there were grants given out to families and men to come out into Illinois and settle, to buy acreage and to populate Illinois. And a lot of families did this because the Eastern Coast was getting crowded. There were a lot of families who were well ingrained on the East Coast, and it was hard to buy up land and property on the East Coast. In addition, we have individuals who have had large families, and so you have younger siblings wanting to move out and make a name for themselves out west. And Illinois was a part of the Western frontier at the time. And a lot of times women who are hoping to better themselves, who have attended schools to become teachers and educators, would go out west to form schools out on the prairie to educate these young children who would move out with their families. Some would be wives of handymen who would travel along with other groups of people traveling from upland Kentucky, Tennessee, and also the Eastern Coast. And so we see these women coming from a variety of different backgrounds. Some were women of class, women who had money, had means, who moved out here to the Midwest. A lot of times we have this vision of women and their children, along with their husbands, on these covered wagons coming out west. Well, sometimes that did happen, and a lot of them were not just coming out to start farms, but some of them just wanted to go on an adventure and start a new life for themselves, and they felt going to the West was one way to do that. Now, the first white settlers that ended up coming into Illinois, some of it has been debated through different family histories. And a lot of these women that came through here, you can find them in a lot of the early settler records, such as the Kelly family that came through. Another account stated that there was a woman who came out to Illinois who was a part of Robert Pulliam's group that came out in October of 1817. Her name is not mentioned in the record, and it's unknown what her relationship was to the group of men that she traveled with. Some stated that she was the wife of a hired man. She's also written down as Strickland's sister, but more than likely she was either married to one of the hired men, but we do know that she did a lot of the cooking and the cleaning for the men that traveled out with Robert Pulliam. And she also journeyed not just out into Illinois, but she traveled along from Edwardsville following the Indian Trail, which is located about 10 miles south of Springfield. And during this time, they ended up building a cabin. So for her to have to travel with all these men and having to take care of them, she had to work from dawn until dusk, not just traveling from one area to the next, but she also had to maintain the company. She had to make sure everyone was fed. She had to make sure that all these men were clothed, all their clothing were patched. In addition to that, she's probably the one that ended up packing up everything. We think of different women today and having to go out and make sure that the car is packed for any type of trip. Well, women did that back during the Western frontier movement. Now, later on, in a lot of the different records that I've looked at in regards to the Pulliams, in the spring the following year, so in 1818, they ended up going into what is known now as St. Clair County, where Pulliam left his wife, Mary Pulliam, who had to basically stay in her home for a long period of time without her husband, without the protection of others. It was basically just the community that she lived in. Now, she may have been, homesick. She was living on her own, and there were some harsh realities. According to a booklet that you can find at the public library here in town, it's called Unsung Heroines, A Salute to Springfield Women. That's where I got some of the names for the people that I had to research. So in looking at what they wrote about her account, she must have been homesick, longing for her mother, her sister, her friends, and others like her in a strange new place. And we get that with a lot of women. They just feel kind of out of place until they find their community. Life was also extremely difficult during these times. You have women who such as Clark, who was a New Salem resident in 1834. She ended up writing to Eastern relatives. She wrote that men can get corn and pork enough to last his family for a fortnight for a single day's work, while a woman must keep scrubbing from morn until night. Women prepared the food, bore and carried the children, spun the thread, wove cloth and made clothes, churned the butter, made soap and candles, and performed most of the humdrum necessity tasks. And so she goes on to talk about the amount of work that she's had to do during this time. And Pulliam had it a little bit differently. She was more of the upper class women that came out to the Midwest, and she had to run her household, make sure she had a hired staff. So she had hired staff to help her, whereas some of the women who did come out to Central Illinois did not have that. So I'm going to add kind of a few imagery. Sadly, we don't have a lot of images of these women. And the ones that we do have, they're mostly paintings and portraits that were made of the women who ventured out here who actually had enough money to have them purchased. And some of the images I'm going to show you are your typical look at what a pioneer appeared. So your typical family that came out to the Midwest was a man, his wife, and multiple children. A typical family would have close to 8 to 10 children. A lot of times, children did not live long enough, and so you kept having children annually. So as soon as a wife bore one child, it wasn't too long until she was pregnant with another. And the reason for having multiple children was to help sustain their family farm. And in addition to that, they had to not only care for the children, but they also had to teach them how to help on the farm. They started at a very young age, and the youngest of girls, you see this toddler here, she would have been taught at a young age to help her mother with home tasks. The little girl that is featured over here, she probably would have already started learning how to stitch up clothing. She also would be learning how to cook with her elder sisters. She would also be working on taking care of the littlest child. These are just some of the tasks that young women had to face growing up. And starting at a young age, it's hard for me today to think of a little 3 or 4-year-old being handled a needle to hand stitch a garment or learn how to darn socks. But during the time, it was a necessity. Now, as we go through and studying the lives of these women, they had to take care of their families during this time, but they also had to look after the cattle if men had to go away for a period. And so they were also in charge of keeping track of the livestock and doing the gathering of the crops if that needed to be done because her husband had to be away for a time. Also, they came across different Native Americans that came into the area, and also they had to make sure that they were protected. So it was important for women to be settled in a strong community. Now, Another woman that is mentioned in the early settlers is Mary Whitesides Kelly. Now, early on, I mentioned some of the earliest families that settled in Sangamon County. The Kellys were one of the first. She kept house here in the Springfield area. She was the wife of John Kelly, whose brother Elijah was one of the first English-speaking frontiersmen to hunt in the valley of the Sangamon River, which is where Sangamon County is. Elijah Kelly loved the area, and he brought his family from North Carolina and settled here in the Sangamon County region in 1819, a year after Illinois became a state. John and Mary had their first cabin in Springfield. Mary kept house. She took care of children. She usually had a household of male guests as well, since there were no inns at first. And so when people would wander through, people would open their homes to people who were coming through either hunting or moving on to their destination. And so women had the task of just running their household, which was not an easy task within itself. They had to care for their children, but then they also maintained a place for people to settle on their way from one destination to the next. So hospitality was part of it. This settlers would also provide bed and board, and so they wouldn't have to pay to actually stay. Men had a distinct idea of what their duties were, and so they tended to not veer from them. So men would stick to hunting, they would stick to cultivating the crops, being kind of in the outside public sphere, connecting their family to the outside world, where women were staying home and maintaining domestic duties. As I stated earlier, families were large, babies arrived annually, and infant and childhood deaths were frighteningly high. The first doctor in the Springfield area was Dr. Gershom Jane. He arrived in 1829, but often there was little he could do for his patients. A lot of times women would end up helping other women deliver their children. Doctors were not always commonplace on the frontier, and so they ended up helping each other out. So as we look in the record, we have the Kellys, we have the Pulliams, then we also have a group of settlers that would meet quite often, and they formed the Old Settlers of Sangamon County. A lot of times during the Old Settlers reunions, the president would send out letters asking people to send remembrances of what they remember from their times here in the early days of Sangamon County. And I show this image over here to showcase a form of transportation for a lot of the settlers that came here. But in looking on Sangamon Link, I was very fortunate to go through it because a lot of the research that I've been doing in the early settler years is going through John Power's book, which if you've seen it, it's huge. It's a huge, huge book. And there are hundreds of women mentioned in it that are from throughout Sangamon County, not just here in Springfield. And luckily, in 1879, now that this is a few years past, the Old Settlers of Sangamon County president, Ronald Diller, read letters that he asked some of the county's pioneer women to write. And he received some from Mahela Ernest Parkinson, who lived from 1811 to 1886, and Sarah Ernest King, who lived from 1806 to 1878. And here is what she said. In response to your request that you would like to hear from the women portion of the Old Settlers of Sangamon County, we will give you some of our experience. Our father moved from Kentucky to St. Clair County, Illinois, in the year 1816 or 1817. Lived there until the fall of 1819, then moved to what is then called Sangamon Country, and settled on Spring Creek, 10 miles west of where Springfield was afterwards located. Our father built camp, which we lived until winter, and considerable snow and very cold, and built a cabin, had to thaw the snow and ice off the boards to lay the roof, then put poles on to hold the boards down. That done, they made punches and laid out part of the floor and put up bedsteads of some kind, and then had to make beds under the bedsteads for us children to sleep on. There being 9 children, and 3 grown persons. The part of the cabin where there was no floor was used as a hearth or a fireplace, leaving a hole in the roof for smoke to get out. This is the way we lived for the first winter. After that, we did a little better. Built a pen at one end of the house for the sheep to keep the wolves from eating them, and the wolves serenaded us nearly every night. The principal part of the provider of our stock was elm and linden or basswood. That was the brush that they used to keep the fire going. They cut down branches for the stock to eat, branches and bark off. Our bed stuff was bought from St. Louis, about 100 miles. They ate mostly cornbread with cold water, baked in a skillet or oven. Was commonly called corn dodger. They had pork, they had venison, turkey, prairie chicken. She goes on to talk about all the different types of game that they would be able to thrive off of here in central Illinois. And then they ended up having more settlers come into central Illinois to buy produce and other materials as well. For their clothes, they had to raise, pick, spin, and weave cotton to make clothes for the winter and summer. So if you can imagine, growing up, I just had to go to a store to go pick up clothing for school. These women had to make them by hand, and not just the clothes, but they also had to make the materials that their clothes were made out of. They ended up using sumac, berries, and walnut bark for coloring of their clothes as well. Now, every night, they would fill a paint cup full of cotton and seed for each parts of the coloring that they would need to make their clothing. And then they would lay it by a fire. And then they would tell them when they could go to bed, or if they had to sit and still hold the cloth out by the fire to dry it. It did not take 15 or 20 yards to make a dress, nor 30 or 40 days to make one. And they were all made by hand. The first school that they went to was 4 miles away, and it was in a town named Andrew, which you can still hear about today because Andrew is still part of Sangamon County. The windows were big cracks with paper pasted over and greased in to let in light. And then they also went to church at a Methodist church that was about 4 miles from their home as well. Now, when I'm reading this, I'm getting a better idea of the strong willpower and work ethic a lot of these women had, because they had certain tasks they had to get done throughout the day, very limited materials, but they also had to get creative. And when we think about all of the different benefits that we have today and how easy it is to find clothing and food and just go to a store or order it online, a lot of these women had to rely on their knowledge, but also to rely on their strong community to work together to take care of each other, but also to make sure everyone had what they needed. Now, if you're interested in the early settlers of Sangamon County, the women who were a part of the early settler groups, as well as learning a lot of the personal stories of these women, sadly, there are not a lot of books written about early female settlers here in the Sangamon County area. You'll find a lot of books for Southern Illinois, Northern Illinois, or other states within the Midwest. But in regards to early settler women here in Sangamon County, you have to go to the original records. You have to look at Powers' work on the early settlers of Sangamon County, but you also need to go to the Illinois historical collections at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. There is a wealth of resources there. A lot of them you can only find in finding aids. They have some of their catalog available for you to find. And if you have an account with them, they are able to help you research some of those records as well, all the way down from early letters to diaries and to personal accounts that have been mentioned to basically family members. There is a book called The Women's Pioneer Story. It's a very good book about a woman who lived here in Sangamon County, and she wrote this book specifically for her daughter to give her an idea of what her life was like being a pioneer out to the Illinois region, coming from Pennsylvania. You can also find the Unsung Heroines book. You will be able to find that at your local library. You can also find it online. I've been able to find it there as well. In addition to that, Sangamo Link has some early settler stories about women, but most of them are about the men who lived here, mostly because men were the ones who wrote the records. And so by diving into some of their stories, you could find the reminiscences of some of the women that traveled along with them. In addition to that, you'll find a lot of women's stories within overall state histories and kind of trying to read between the lines a little bit. It's not a quick index search. You definitely have to dig to find a lot of these women because their records were not fully recorded. It's thanks to individuals like Diller who did request the early pioneer women to write their stories down. Now, this week I told you the stories about the pioneer women and some of them who were able to write down their personal remembrances to give you an idea of how many women that came out here in the earlier years of Sangamon County's history. In 1823, there were 30 families, just families. In 1831, there were 850 persons living in the Sangamon County area. By 1835, there was a little over 1,419 persons. And so you find in the earlier days from statehood until the 1830s, there was a low number of people. And so finding those early records, key names will pop out to you because they will pop up over and over within the catalog records as you do your archival research. Now, as we get into the latter part of the 19th century and the turn of the 20th, this is where we start to see more women. We see more activism, more social change, women who are fighting to vote for schooling for their children. But you also see women who have means who are wanting to reach out and make their communities better. And so when we come into our next episode here on the Community Trailblazers, we are going to talk about two women who focused on children and the women within their community. And these women were Elizabeth Brown-Ide, and we're going to be also talking about Eva Carol Monroe. Both of these women were iconic in their own right. They fought for the rights of children and to make lives and education better for children and women within the Central Illinois area. They have two really big stories. I'm kind of sad that I don't get to tell the whole story because I want you to go out and I want you to discover these women within the record. And so I will have a number of sources for you in the next episode talking about these iconic women who blazed a trail for the women who now live in Central Illinois and the women who live here in the state of Illinois. So tune in next time as we talk about more iconic women. And I hope that you'll be able to tune in, and I hope you enjoyed the program today. If you are interested in learning more about the women that I discussed, feel free to reach out to us at Sangamon Experience at uis.edu. In addition, like I've been mentioning in every episode that we've had, we have an exhibit coming March 22nd called Hometown Pride. And this is giving our community and our institutions an opportunity to showcase what they love about their town here in Sangamon County and what they love about it. And this gives you an opportunity to showcase historic markers, stories that you may have heard throughout your time living in, say, Chatham, Rochester, Auburn, New Berlin. Stories that you think are very important and that need to be remembered. Please send them to Sangamon Experience at uis.edu. And we would love to have them included in our digital exhibit, Hometown Pride, coming to you March 22nd here on social media, but also on our website. So I hope you'll stay tuned for that. Thank you again for joining us on Community Trailblazers, the Women of Sangamon County. And I hope to see you next time where we talk about women and civic engagement. All right. Have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you next week.